Welcome to Cultivate the Ordinary podcast, curious conversations for the anxious, frustrated, and bored. I'm Travis.
And I'm Jessie. So often we're held captive by screens, schedules, and media that's mind-numbing and polarizing. This leaves us seeing dimly through a fog. We want to spark more imagination and a better awareness of God's presence in the everyday.
Join us on a fun journey of discovery and curiosity as we look at the ordinary through the lenses of joy, wonder, beauty, and hope. Well, welcome to the podcast today. I'm joined with my father-in-law, Jim Dotson, who's down here all the way from Washington, Missouri, right outside of St. Louis. He just saw his beloved Cards win a baseball game today, so we should be feeling pretty good today, huh, Jim?
You bet.
And Jim and Julie are down visiting us this last week because our oldest son, Jay, just graduated high school today. So that we took that in today. Wow. I mean, what does that feel like for you as a grandpa for your first
Oh, it's pretty amazing. That's
grandson?
The first of my grandchildren to graduate high school. It was really special.
And with my work with America's Kids Belong, I literally just got off a podcast today where we interviewed a guest who was formerly in foster care and got her doctorate. And the whole theme of the episode was about overcoming hurdles from foster care. And so there's a stat that something like 50% of kids coming from foster care graduate high school compared to nearly 90% from their peers. So, and then college, you can imagine, just significant. So, big deal, really big deal. I'm excited for Jay. So excited to have you on, Jim, today. When I think of Jim, I just think of someone that, for me, I've lost my dad about 2 years ago, and I've always been close to Jim. Feels like a sort of a second dad for me now in this phase of my life. Love him. Loving Jesse's daughter, my wife, and the kids, and he was always there for my dad, looking back. And so, yeah, this is really special to be on together on this. There's we were just kind of reminiscing just on stories recently as I got Jim to agree to do this podcast, and never forget when I'm just already laughing, but when I asked for his daughter's hand, this was 2007. I'll have to edit this if that's wrong, and then I'll also be in really big trouble. But we'll go with that. But anyway, Jim was out in the yard as he often would be, and that's going to be a theme of this podcast, nature and stuff. But I remember I had something to tell him that morning, and I remember approaching you with the news, and you were shoveling, or was that?
Yeah, we were working together in the front of the house, planting some shrubbery or something. We had shovels and hoes and so on, and we were working out front when you brought the subject up. So I knew Jim was all in for me. You already really loved him, and I felt part of the family already. But and this you're still asking. It's he could have had a bad morning. I don't know what's going on. So he's got the shovel, and I think I told you, I got something to tell you. Can we go sit down, and can you leave that shovel there or something? Yeah, he suggested I leave the shovel behind for this conversation.
Yeah, I don't think my peace of mind seeing that shovel come with you and then me to sit down, I don't know where that would have led. So I needed a clear mind there. But anyway, so really this podcast, we're going to talk really about some of Jim's life and his stories, but so much about Jim and how he views the world and worships God and sort of has so much wonder is toward nature. There's an incredible line wanted to read from that's right up his alley in the world of insects. Jim's an entomologist, right? Is that your actual? And he'll talk about that. Here's the line from Timothy Radcliffe. He says, "If we do not look downwards and immerse ourselves in the delightful complexity of our world, think of the 350,000 species of beetle already identified. How shall we look upwards and glimpse infinity?
And that's just beetles.
Right. So that's just beetles, and this is a guy who knows something about that quote, knows about studying beetles and insects. So before we get into all that and kind of this whole thing of the natural sciences of nature, Jim, tell us more about you, your family, kind of what's keeping you busy right now in your retirement.
Well, I've been retired 8 years now, and I'm loving it. People tell you that you'll be bored in retired. Don't believe it. I haven't been bored one day in retirement. I have 8 grandkids, which keep me busy. Some of them are more local, and then some we have to come to South Carolina, like Travis and Jesse's family, to see them, 2 or 3 times a year. I do a lot of hunting and fishing. I do a lot of yard work. I take great pride in my landscaping and my yard back home. And I'm heavily involved in my church. I'm the men's ministry leader at church, and that involves some men's fellowship and some men's discipleship. I'm also a teaching pastor, which in our particular congregation means I get to preach 3 or 4 times a year, give the pastor a break, and I enjoy that. I love that, the preparation and so on. I'm a beekeeper, and that is absolutely fascinating. I love beekeeping just from the standpoint of pure interest.
Well, before we get into, man, it's such an array of things here to talk about. Let's start with bees. I mean, we already invoked it, so I'm already. Tell us more about just bees, beekeeping. What is fascinating about that? After your whole career studying, sort of bees and insects and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, I spent about 40 years studying and learning about insects and working with insects to a certain degree. But bees are fascinating in that they're a social insect, so they have castes. They have the queen, they have drones, the male caste, which really has no function whatsoever except reproducing with the queen. And then the vast majority, 99.9% of the colony are workers, which are sterile females. And there's all sorts of nuances to the biology of bees, which are fascinating. If something should happen to the queen, the hive doesn't necessarily die out. The workers can create a substance called royal jelly, feed to a worker who's already a female, and she becomes fertile. And so they can replace the queen that way. So those are the sorts of things that are just fascinating.
So some of that stuff on the science and kind of biology and some of that behind bees, was a lot of that stuff you knew from your time studying them, and then now you're actually as a hobbyist kind of doing the beekeeping, like, because you had never done the beekeeping side of.
Not so much, Travis. I really didn't deal directly with honeybees in my work, but beekeeping is something I took up in partnership with a neighbor and a gentleman I go to church with. We're partners on 3 hives, 3 colonies. We produce about 12 gallons of honey per year on an average, which is more than our families will ever use. We really prefer not to sell the honey. We just give away lots of Christmas gifts.
That's cool. So I think those of us that know very little about beekeeping, there's that outside, you look at it and it's like, how are you not, I mean, I know you have protective gear, but there's never fear around a big hole that you didn't see, or never any scares around.
No, I'm usually quite careful when I zip up my bee suit, but, very rarely get stung. I might get, 6 or 8 stings a year. Which is probably not that much more than the average person might get.
Yeah, that's that might be what's keeping me away from it. But maybe someday I'll venture into that. But love it, love the honey. It's such a cool thing. Going back, sort of as I look at you and your life now, so you worked for Bayer Pharmaceuticals, or the Bayer. What would you describe the
I work for Bayer Crop
crop
Science, which is the agriculture wing of the company. It's a truly global company. I worked, first of all, right out of graduate school. I just got my master's in entomology at the University of Missouri, and I went to work for the Missouri Department of Agriculture as an area entomologist, which was a regulatory position. I was inspecting nurseries, greenhouses, sod farms, and so on, enforcing the Missouri plant law, which involves movement of plant material and thereby potential movement of insect pests. So I worked for them for 5 years, and then I got a position with Bayer Crop Science in research at their research facility outside of Kansas City. And I worked in research for Bayer in 2 or 3 different capacities for 15 years. Then I sort of hit the glass ceiling a little bit. I did not have a PhD. I had a master's. And to go any further in research with Bayer, I was going to pretty much need the PhD. So I moved over to sales, and then I had a sales career for 20 years, and that was all in one location in the St. Louis area. I had a huge territory because we were a relatively small group. My group sold products into primarily the commercial pest control business, roaches, termites, so on. So it was a relatively small market. That meant bigger territory. So for much of that last 20 years, I covered 8 states myself. It's not as bad as it sounds because we didn't write orders ourselves. We sold through distribution. So the vast majority of my work was training. When you're working with pesticides, it's very important that your customers have the proper training. And so I was training somewhere, either a pest control company, a trade association, or something of that nature, probably 2 or 3 times a week.
On the road a lot. So, yep, Jess' wife talks about, it was like growing up with Dad on the road 4 days out of the 7, or sometimes? Or?
I spent about 140 nights a year in a hotel room.
So one of the cool things about kind of seeing that journey and then where you are now is, in terms of faith too, it's that, you think about how the way God kind of repurposes and uses our gifts in new ways for his glory, through our lives. And I think about the disciples who were these, by trade fishermen. And then at one point then with following Jesus, it's like, no, you're going to still be fishers of men. And you're going to cast nets in sort of this, analogy of sort of catching men into the kingdom. And looking at you, how God has given you through your work with Bayer and, as a presenter and educator, the gift of, being able to teach, and connect with an audience, like how God's, used that now in your, being a, how do you describe your pastorship as a lay pastor?
It's a lay servant, if you will. And it, unlike some folks, I'm perfectly comfortable talking in front of anywhere from, 25 people to 250 people. I've done it all.
So that helps when you're giving a sermon to go up and actually be able to do that. So I've loved that. And then I also think just about, so before we kind of then get into more of this theme on nature and stuff, you're in a men's group that you've been meeting with in St. Louis or Washington actually for a couple of years. Tell us a little bit about that. I've actually gone to it a couple times. Really cool. I mean, the guys are, tell us about it. Yeah,
it's Travis is referring specifically to the men's disciple group that I lead. It's a small group, generally 7 or 8 guys on a Thursday morning. We meet at a local coffee shop, and we primarily do Bible study. We're studying the book of Ephesians right now, and it's a bunch of guys that are all retired because we meet at 8 o'clock in the morning. So guys that are working attend a different discipleship group that my church has. But it's we've gotten very, very close. You know, again, a small group like that, you talk about a little of everything. But these guys are really close to my heart. I'd do anything for them. They would do anything for me, and it's really a neat experience.
Yeah, yeah. Just Jim invited me along as a young dude with all these, sage guys sitting around who just, what I had seen from the outside was just these guys that come together and, like you said, love one another, kind of are just seeking collectively through their community to seek God and answers and wisdom. And it's just like that rhythm is really, I think of all the men that don't have that and how different their lives would be if they, would kind of have that place to anchor them and to call home in that way.
Yeah, we also have another discipleship group that is catered to younger men because it meets during one evening a week. And so the guys that are working attend that group. And it's very successful and very similar in many ways.
Yeah. Well, and you have a great line that you had just told me a day or so ago of kind of that you've told your men's group, and it's kind of a joke that you guys share together, but where, instead of a immediate conversion experience, tell us how you describe your coming to the
again,
Lord.
Even in a small group of 7 or 8 guys, we have a variety of experiences. We have guys within the group that had a Damascus Road type experience where they found Jesus just right now. And then we have others like myself, and I like to refer to it as marinating in Christ. I wasn't terribly Christ-centered until my wife and I were married 44 years ago. She's been a tremendous influence on me, and perhaps more than anything, she encouraged me, maybe held a club over my head a little bit at first, and then it moved into encouragement, and then I started picking up on all of the things that a relationship with Christ can mean. And so I gradually became a stronger and stronger Christian, and I refer to it as marination.
So Jim is a teriyaki marinated believer. I don't know how far we want to take this, but I love that, and I think like even we see, Paul talks about this idea of this present sense of being saved. Even you are being saved, not just we were saved. This ongoing process, sanctification is that. But I love that you say it that way because certainly people have dramatic sort of like you described, a Damascus road experience. We hear about, especially in Islamic countries, you're hearing about dreams that were just clearly Christ that broke through any language barrier or barrier to even get in the country, and people are converting to Christianity out of a dream. So, but I love that there's also a journey for some that's a very long. Marination is such a great. I love that as a term, and just soaking in the juices of.
Well, and just like marinating a steak in the kitchen, the longer you stay, the longer you keep that steak in the marinade, the stronger the marinade becomes. And that's the way I feel Christ is with me.
Yeah, no, I love that. There's probably not, I'm not guessing there's not maybe a lot of ladies that would use marinade. That's for guys, us grillers and steak.
Guys that own a Blackstone grill.
That's right. So, yeah, well, okay, so that kind of catches us all up to, where you are now kind of in your own life and stuff like that. Now let's pivot into sort of the theme really is around nature and talking about kind of that in your story and how nature's played such a role in the way you worship and see God. And so where did your love of nature start in your story?
My love of nature, without question, came from my dad. We lived in a very small town in southern Missouri in the Ozark Mountains, and my dad was a livestock farmer, which kept him pretty busy most of the time, but he always had time for my brother and myself. There were 2 siblings in the family, and I vividly remember as young as 4 or 5 years old, my dad taking my brother and I over into the national forest nearby with a cast iron skillet, building a campfire, taking a dozen eggs and a pound of bacon, and fixing breakfast. And in that process, we would listen to wild turkeys gobbling in the woods. We would listen to the sounds of all of the wildlife there. And starting at that young an age, it just impressed on me the importance and the grandeur of nature.
Yeah, I love that. And you just said what I was thinking of a quote. One of my favorite quotes of all time by the Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins says, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God." Charged with the grandeur of God. It makes me think about that when we go out into nature, when we let our eyes and our imagination be filled with wonder, that we encounter a world. When you think of charged, I mean, you think of this electricity of so much is going on, so much. And really, that's, as you study natural sciences, that's exactly what you are finding. So much is going on underneath each step on the ground.
Yeah. My kids, when they were very small, used to love it when we'd be camping out or taking a hike or whatever, and to walk in the woods is a real adventure with me because it's time consuming because it's like every other step there is something to teach my children and now my grandchildren about nature.
So kids are, can we just get to the lake, Grandpa? I don't need another brown squirrel, lecture. That's great. So, but I mean, I think like that, and you haven't lost that sense of wonder for nature. I mean, that's another really cool thing that, you're still learning and still seeing the world in those eyes. So take us then from that, so that's always been sort of part of your story in nature and your dad, sort of the origin of that. And then what then led you into as a career studying the natural sciences and eventually becoming an entomologist and then everything?
Yeah, I had this experience of a lot of nature growing up as a child. And when I graduated from high school and went off to college, I was going to be a wildlife management major. Now, unfortunately, that was a period of time shortly after Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, and therefore everybody wanted to be a wildlife management major. And I saw classmates that were graduating with a 3-point plus grade point average that were pumping gas because they couldn't get a job.
Wow.
So I fortunately switched my major from wildlife management to biology. And I graduated with a bachelor's degree in biology. Then I immediately went on to graduate school. Graduate school was an interesting experience because I still considered myself a natural scientist. I hadn't narrowed in on any particular group of animals to study because I loved it all. So I went to the University of Missouri one week and went to several departments, checked out who had financial money available, who didn't, and so on. I narrowed it down to 3 fields. I would either want to be a veterinarian or a wildlife management major. I still had that option, or an entomologist. I found that entomology was fascinating for me. As it turns out, nothing had changed with the wildlife management. There was a waiting list of like 300 people to get into that program. Veterinary science could have happened, but I would have needed to take at least one more full semester of prerequisites to qualify for veterinary school. So I chose entomology, and there at the time they happened to have a number of programs within the entomology department. I chose livestock entomology because that's what I grew up with. I grew up on a livestock farm, and it was fascinating to me. They had, fortunately, a full research assistantship to provide me, which means graduate school didn't cost me a dime. And that was a tremendous blessing, and it kind of sent me down this road of being an entomologist.
So livestock entomology would be the study of insects on cows, like
on and around.
On and around, okay.
There's a lot of pests of flies and things on cattle that essentially live somewhere else, but they are nuisances on cattle or horses and so on. Then there are insect parasites that actually live on those animals. It's not a field that's for the faint of heart, but it was fascinating for me.
It's funny too how narrow some of these fields can focus down. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
into that, like, you know, bovine bugs. It's like, so you want to talk some bugs, more bugs this point?
Sure, absolutely.
Talk bugs all day.
Yeah, I could share with you if you were talking about how dramatic some of the focus was on entomology. Being in livestock entomology, it just so happened that my major professor helped me select a field of research. That field of research happened to be working out the taxonomic description and the biology of a small staphylinid beetle. A staphylinid are a group of beetles that are carnivorous, and these beetles actually feed on the immature stages of the face fly. The face fly is a significant pest of cattle. The face fly happens to spend all of its immature life in cow patties out in the pasture. And so obviously that's where this beetle spent its time. So I like to say I spent about 2 years of my education laying on my stomach with my face about 2 feet from a cow patty.
Oh man, well, that's not everyone's career path, but it was your calling, as it were. Yeah, I mean, so really the study of pests, you know, kind of profession became the vocation of your career as a salesman for Bayer, really?
Yeah, well, as I got into working for Bayer, and I was with Bayer for 35 years altogether, the first 15 years, again, I was in research and development, and we were primarily, I started out on a research farm in the Kansas City area, and then moved to field positions. But it all involved essentially screening of experimental insecticides primarily against insect pests, and under very controlled conditions. And that's how I got into it. And then when I switched over to sales, again, I was still selling those same products. They were commercial products. They were no longer experimental, selling those same products to structural pest control companies.
So, you know, the business side of it for sales, obviously you had to be motivated to, you know, meet goals and things like that. Was there a part of that work that felt also like you were I imagine like helping people significantly, whether it was a farm, that time personally on people, and was that the humanity side of?
Oh, absolutely. And I, you know, the best example I've got is after I had been in sales for, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 or 5 years, my manager came to me, and at the time, I was calling on both pest control companies, golf course superintendents, and lawn care companies. So it was a fairly broad sector. At the time, my group, the group within Bayer that I worked for, they were going to split the pest control from the green industry, so to speak. And he gave me a choice. And I think people were a bit surprised because I had spent much of my previous career with the Department of Agriculture and so on, working with plants. So they were kind of surprised when I chose structural pest control. But the pure and simple reason was when I went into a lawn care company or a golf course superintendent, those guys, even back in those days, were tied directly to the extension service. They got most of their information from the university. And the structural pest control company, the University of Missouri at the time didn't really have a pest control presence. So they didn't have a source of information. So they came to me for that. And so it just gave me a greater sense of belonging, I guess, to be able to teach an industry that is more than eager to hear what I've got to say.
Looking back, was that maybe one of the biggest accomplishments or proud moments of that work in that space?
Yeah, it is, and there's a certain amount of ego involved in it. I as my career went through that 20 years of sales, I was heavily involved in. Again, I traveled 8 different states. So it involved a number of trade associations, state trade associations, local associations, and these folks needed speakers because they gave certification credits for education. And so, they would call me up and say, would you like to come to our conference and, speak for an hour on cockroaches or speak for an hour on flies? And, it varied. It kept it interesting because every conference I would be speaking on something different. And of course I had, by that time, digital laptop computers had come along, so I had PowerPoint files that made it a little easier. I didn't have to organize slides by hand like I did in the old days. And so I had, pre-programmed presentations dealing with these different groups of insects. And I would vary them a little depending on the audience, but it was fascinating. And to speak to, again, 200, 250 people in a room and have their attention and getting lots of questions when my presentation was over, that's all I needed.
Did you have like a go-to opening bug joke? Was there always the
I did not. I was not one of those guys. Okay. I knew plenty of guys that opened with a joke,
yeah,
but
I'm sure.
I always thought, boy, if I fail on that joke, they're not going to listen to a word I say.
Play it safe here, risk of humor. So, all right, got to know this. Top 3 coolest insects in your book. Top 3.
We already talked about one. The honeybee would definitely be one. Again, an example of a social insect. Termites are also a social insect. Ants are a social insect. These are insects that function as a society based upon different castes, and each caste has a function or a role within the population. That makes it fascinating for me. The second one would be something that's happening right now, at least in the Midwest, and that is the emergence of the periodical cicada. The 13-year brood of the periodical cicada is emerging in mass in the Midwest now, and they are fascinating because when they will lay their eggs in the twigs on the ends of tree branches. To a certain extent, they, particularly on larger trees, they can actually prune those trees and make the tree more attractive. On smaller trees, sometimes they can get a little bit much, but there's really nothing you can do about it. It's part of nature. And when those twigs that have the eggs in them break off and fall to the ground, the eggs hatch on the ground. The small, tiny cicadas then, which are cicada nymphs, go into the soil, and they will be in the soil for 13 years before we see them again.
Wow.
There's also a 17-year brood.
That's
so
crazy.
This is what makes them fascinating. They can stay essentially dormant. They can feed on tree roots and that sort of thing for 13 or 17 years between the sightings, so to speak.
Wow.
And then I guess the third one is fascinating. It's not a major insect pest or anything like that, but the walking stick, because the walking stick is a perfect example of insect mimicry, where the insect is essentially evolved to look like something else in nature, and a walking stick looks like a stick, and it protects them from a lot of predators. And I find that fascinating. There's lots of examples of insect mimicry that are really cool.
Also just shows the creativity of the creator, that some of these things, they're just mind-blowing.
No accident,
right? Unbelievable. And then then on the other side, there's things. I grew up in North Dakota where the state bird was the mosquito. They were huge, boy. Yeah. I mean, so then there's the other. For me, my worst, I think, are things that jump on you. So as a farm kid, grasshoppers would, oh man. And then here in South Carolina, I think they call them here camel crickets or barn cricket. Those speckled things, and you open a door into a darker, and they're on you.
They're very opportunistic.
That's right. They show their love like right away. So, okay. So any bugs scare you personally, either that you would, I mean, obviously poisonous things you don't want to, but was there ever, or maybe an infestate, like a...
Well, there's a couple of particular insects that all of us need to be very wary about. The first one is bed bugs. Bed bugs have been essentially in epidemic mode for the last 10 or 12 years because they're a hitchhiker. And if we happen to stay in a hotel or some other type of facility where we're sleeping, they can come home with us on our luggage. And once you get them in your home, it's not an easy thing to get rid of them. You can't successfully use bombs and this and that. You almost have to have a commercial pest control company come in. That may cost you $800 to $1,000 to get rid of those bed bugs. So that bed bugs are something that I'm very leery about. I used to have a system when I was in a hotel room for 140 nights a year, and I never brought bed bugs home with me, because when I walked through the door into that hotel room, I put my luggage in the bathtub, and then I did a quick inspection. Again, I taught a lot of people how to do a bed bug inspection. I did a quick inspection to make sure there weren't any bed bugs in the room, and then I felt comfortable unpacking my luggage. But that never failed me. I never brought bed bugs home in the 20 years I was on the road.
I think you being up giving a presentation with bed bug bites all over your body probably wouldn't
have been the best example.
Credibility of either the product or what you're talking about.
And the other group of they're not actually insects, but they're arthropods that I've got a world of respect for, particularly recently, and that's ticks. Ticks have always been around, and when I was a kid, ticks were ticks. They were kind of a pest. If you got into a nest of ticks or chiggers, for that matter, it would itch you for a few days, but then they went away. Since that time, there's a whole plethora of diseases that have been associated with ticks. Ticks are real disease carriers, and therefore some of these diseases are serious, like Lyme disease and things like that. We have to be very, very cautious when we go into the woods, particularly. I always spray my pant legs down with a repellent, an aerosol repellent that repels ticks, so that I'm not, bringing them home with me. And I still, that night when I take my shower, I still do a tick check.
Another public service announcement. Check for those ticks. But it's getting to that point where many people now know people that have Lyme disease or are struggling with it. Right. So you're right. That's becoming quite a big deal. So I love again, it's very clear that you, just see the world through wonder. You still are learning, and haven't been done learning about bugs, in some way. It's always going to pique your interest. Teaching your grandkids about the world.
I can't think of anything neater than if one or more of my grandkids would don a beekeeping suit. They make them in child sizes, and join me at my beehives so that I could teach them that. Now that's got to be their decision, because it's not 100% risk-free.
Sure.
But it's largely risk-free if you suit up properly.
Yeah. As we close this out, what is if you could think about, what is inspiring you today? Whether it's something in life, maybe it's something with your, you think of anything that would...
Well, I
finding inspiration.
I think the church work is extremely inspiring for me. I'm interacting with people not so much as a teacher, but a moderator and a friend. Preparing a sermon, which again I do 3 or 4 times a year. Everybody's a little different. We have 3 or 4 teaching pastors at our church, and some of them are just have a gift of just walking out on the stage and speaking for 20 minutes about a particular subject or scripture verses and so on. I'm not that way. I need some preparation. I generally will prepare for about 3 weeks before I give a sermon, because I want it to be factual. I want it to be scripture-based, and that's my process. But in that 3-week process, I'm learning so much. Even scripture verses that I've known for years, really digging into them, I learn so much more.
Yeah, that's well said. And it's inspiring, too, to see the word in new, fresh ways that maybe you hadn't, as you read scripture, and the living and active, aspect of it makes total sense of that happening too.
And I have to give our pastor a lot of credit. Our pastor willingly passes the baton to, again, 3 or 4 other people that he knows will do a good job, but he's willing to step back and let us share in that process. And it's pretty cool on his part that his ego will let him do that.
Well, and that's the downfall of many churches, is the pastor that can't do that for himself, just the self-care that's necessary for his own health. But that humility and I think that's what a good picture of the church is shared leadership to do that, hear others speak the word, and very cool. Yeah, I love that. Really loved having you on today. This was fun. Just the stories, the bugs, the journey through your life, and seeing the world with wonder. Thanks for being on.
Love being here. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks for listening to the podcast today. I hope you found something helpful, hopeful, or thought-provoking. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to any resources mentioned in the podcast. And we also have links in the notes for our own resources to check out. We would really love to hear from you. And we're also really grateful for your support by sharing the podcast episodes with your friends and family and leaving a rating and review. May we all regain and maintain our wonder, hope, and inspiration as we look at our ordinary through new and fresh eyes.